They were sending me a bunch of stuff home, and I'm like, I don't want to take stuff that you need to sell. And they're like, this is actually like a swap, and then we sell what's left. I'm like, okay, this is way more convenient than having a swap at my house, where I have to do all the work. And so I just can do cool things and take it to them, and it works.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to session 3 of 4 about breaking free from imposter syndrome. Is the camera doing okay, Lydia? Sorry, I just got the video from last week's session done just yesterday. It takes an exorbitant amount of time to get the closed captioning anywhere near correct. And I wanted to make sure I did that before I sent that one out. So they will all be recorded. You may not get them until right before the next one happens. So I disclaimer. So I wanted to start this session by just reviewing a little bit from the last session, because when I watched the video and worked with the video over the weekend, I realized that the people in Zoom were probably not going to be able to see anything that I wrote on the board. And so one of the things I want to do is kind of go back to go forward, because it feels like if you could see the visuals from that, it would be harder. So I'm going to try to fix that today. But before we do, I just want to do a little bit of review from last week's session, because I think that the way I'm inviting you to go about this is different. I don't know if it feels different to you, but I think it's kind of a different approach to sort of interrupting any unhelpful thought pattern, which is what I see imposter syndrome is a collection of beliefs you gather throughout time that tell you that you are not as capable as you actually are, and that in moments when those beliefs are not activated, they don't actually bother us very much. But when they are activated and we're participating with them, even struggling with them, then they consume all of our energy and they have a very detrimental effect on us. And so we may not be able to be people who just don't have those thoughts anymore. But the good news is we don't have to be people who have gotten rid of the thoughts. We have to be people who, when those thoughts activate, we believe them less, we're less impacted by them, and we know how to process them in a way that allow them to come and go. I probably have some imposter-related thought every day. That's probably a pretty fair guess. But I don't hang out all day in imposter syndrome thinking. So really wanting you to be able to live more free of it, even though you may still have them. Because some of the coding happened when we were little, when we were kids, and it got in there and we collected. Some of it's based on gender coding, some of it's based on other cultural coding, some of it we just made up all by ourselves, drawing conclusions that we didn't need to draw, and then holding those like they're actual truths when really they're just thoughts we had one time that we decided to hold. So the first part really is about the ability to start waking up the part of you that can witness that the thoughts have been activated. And I'm just curious if anybody in the room or anybody through chat can tell us what you've noticed this week. Were you able to notice yourself at all this week? I'm just was the witness more awake this week for you? Anybody have any moment they can recall where they noticed themselves? And then if you could share how the noticing helped. Anybody willing to do that? Go ahead. And a little bit loud so the microphones can pick you up.
Okay. It wasn't related necessarily to imposter syndrome, but I have a 17-month-old, and he's really busy and very active and doesn't communicate very well yet. And so I've noticed I get really irritated, and being able to recognize that and walk away, leave him with my husband, leave him safe, but remove myself from the situation temporarily helps tremendously. If I don't do that, I get angry. I end up saying things that aren't appropriate or nice to him. And so recognizing that has been helpful.
So there was a moment when you witnessed that you were in an upset and saying things or about to say things, and your ability to witness that allowed you not to engage in that, and then it came and it went, you took care of yourself a different way.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a great example of how helpful it is to have the witness turned on. And without the witness turned on, we're just caught up in our thoughts and acting out of them all the time. Like, if we don't have any clue that we have a part of us that can do that, we don't get any of the benefit of that perspective is really what it is. One person describes this as the difference between being a character in a play, running around with no script, bumping into other characters, not understanding the bigger picture, and having no direction, versus being in the audience, able to see the whole stage with the lights up, being able to communicate with your character so that you can actually say, boy, they were trying to upset you, don't say what you're going to say. You know? Don't press send on that email. Like, walk away from the little one. Right? Did you get it all that the little one wasn't creating your experience? Like, because that's another part we talked about last week, is trying to shift you all from thinking that your experience in any moment is created by the circumstance versus knowing that there's a circumstance happening, cranky baby, and I call it cranky baby. And then in one moment you might have one thought about that and have one reaction, and then another moment a completely different. Like that one would go away and you might have a different thought about it, right? Like I should go away, or like I'm not fit for parenting in this moment.
Which then leads into the imposter syndrome.
Okay.
I have to pretend like I'm a good mom. I should be better than this.
Okay. That's how that would happen. If I had a room of 1,000 parents and said, have you ever had a moment when cranky baby was frustrating you and you wanted to lose your temper? Raise your hand or do one of those, what do you call it, everybody poll things where you could, anonymously say it. I'm guessing a pretty high percentage of people have that experience. But when we have it, we tell ourselves we're the only one, and we get shame triggered, like we should be able to not do that, when I don't think in any parenting book it says you should be able to not have that. The question is, can you witness it and help yourself not act out of it? So in that regard, that's the same mechanism that we're wanting you to notice this. Because if they double witness points, if you notice that, and then you notice that as you leave to get a space, you start judging yourself, and that's when the imposter parenting thoughts would activate. Right now you're just having an imposter moment that also needs to be processed the same way. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely.
Anybody else have one?
There's a few on chat, so I'll just read them all and we can have a discussion. So one person said, I noticed how rarely I notice and how often it feels like I'm on autopilot, allowing those thoughts to direct me without being fully conscious of them. And someone else said, I witnessed my mud mind and caught it after a minute or so. While the process repeated, I feel like it's a stepping stone to recognize it. And then this person also said, I also realized how it tremendously affects my body to be a negative thought, tightened chest, twisted stomach. And then I'll just read, there's two more. So I had lunch with someone else from this class, and we noticed that both of us made reference to how lucky, quote unquote, we were about our job situation, when in reality, we were both very qualified for our positions. And then lastly, I realized how much I rely on positive affirmation because I don't believe myself even when I know I've done a great job on something.
So that last one is not yet witnessing that you're telling yourself stuff that's not true, and you're like looking for the corresponding data that would tell you that you're not awful, right? The one before that about lucky, what I love about that example is that's a person witnessing or co-witnessing themselves noticing an imposter thought. It's like, oh, did you just hear us? We both just talked about how lucky we were. So noticing and helping someone else notice that is a habitual thought that we have. Now, once we notice that thought, our witness could get curious about it. Kind of hold that up to the light and sort of say, wow, what is that about? Gosh, that's really about, that's like practicing critical awareness of why you would have some of the thoughts you had. First step, you have to witness that you're having it, otherwise you're so busy in it and believing it that you can't even tell. And the second piece is once you're witnessing, it's sort of like more curiously, like, so what's up with that? And where did that come from? Like doing some work to like have a new thought about thought habits that you have, that can be helpful, but like I said last week, it's not helpful when you're still in it. But to have some perspective about it could be really helpful. The part about your body, yeah, we put our bodies through so much that is not necessary, right? Because one-to-one, there's a one-to-one correlation, like the thought that you're attached to is going to come to life in your body. It just has to. That's just the way we're, like by design, that's the way we work. And so when we have thoughts that are fear-based all the time, our body's trying to process that all the time, even though it's not necessary. So all of those kind of fit into the process that I'm trying to teach you, which I get you're not going to get fully in this session and then session 4 for next week. I'm just trying to get you intrigued enough to have you be on a new learning path where you can learn all the different pieces. And I know there's folks in the room that have seen me in different classes, kind of putting the pieces together so that you can have more understanding about how you operate. So the next one is this idea of remembering who you are. And so in a moment of witnessing, I'm wondering if anybody had the sense of sort of seeing yourself out there and kind of having a homecoming moment. You're nodding yes. Can you share that one?
Sure. We have a staff member who took a promotion, so she's leaving the department, and her direct supervisor reports to me, and she said she's sort of acting out a little bit. I don't know if she realizes it, and I'm not sure how, like she's trying to push away. I'm not sure how to guide her with that. And so I started having a conversation with her, and then in a typical mode of dummying down things, I said, well, I think there might be like 5 steps of grieving. You could go through those with her. And I stopped myself and I said, no, wait a minute. I know there are 5 steps to grieving. These are really the steps that you need to talk with her about, because even in a situation of transition, she's going to be in one of those 5 steps. We don't know how she feels, but these are the steps that probably are going to be most helpful to you. But I literally stopped myself and said, I'm not going to dummy it down. I'm not going to say there might be, because I know there are.
Mm-hmm. So you just sort of like reaffirmed yourself and moved your voice from passive to more solid.
Yeah.
Right. And did you feel yourself come home?
It was uncomfortable.
Okay. Because you were then going to take a risk?
Well, it was uncomfortable because it's I don't want to come across as knowing too much.
Breaking a rule, right? Trying to find the sweet spot between dumbing down and being a know-it-all.
Yeah.
Right. And then when you step into that, you will feel vulnerability because you're doing it differently than you've done it before. And that's going to bring that uncomfortable feeling that we all try to avoid, because we try to avoid it, it keeps us stuck. But really it's whenever there's risk, emotional exposure, and the not yet known. So you were vulnerable and sort of bringing that back around. I'm wanting you to try on this week, like noticing that I once used a custodian's keychain. You know those like keychains that retract, right? And so I said, could I borrow your keys? Because I was like, when you're close to home, you feel grounded and centered and at your best. You're wise, you have grace, you have clarity, you have wisdom. And then in a moment when we start getting our thinking going, it's sort of like getting out here. Now I was jangling his keys out here. I'm like, this makes a lot of noise, but it's like, you could actually, if you could whip that around, you could hurt somebody with that, right? It's not necessarily what you would say here. So I'm wanting you to have this moment of noticing yourself caught up in a thought. And as you release it, this sense of like returning back to who you were before you just made that up, right? That's been really helpful to me. Like, I want to know that my default setting is calm and grounded and clear and wise, open, curious. Nothing's broken, right? It's a resting place. And I want to know whenever I scare myself with something, like I make up a story that something's going to turn out horrible, for example. When I notice myself doing that, it's really helpful for me to know that there's who I was before I just grabbed hold of that thought and made up that story. This is what happens. We're doing something brave, a thought comes through, what if we don't know enough? We grab hold of it and hang out with it. We want to know, we want to return back to who we were before we hooked onto that thought. Right? And I know, like I didn't believe this when somebody was trying to help me see this back in my early 30s. But I came to believe it because I started to notice when I was calm and centered and at my best, I started to notice that when I didn't have a thought, particularly a scary thought on my mind, I kind of just rested in my health. And that taught me, that's why I'm wanting you to notice it, because that taught me that that's who I really am, that's my default setting. A lot of us feel like at default, we're like not okay, right? And that's because we haven't let ourselves really experience our true innate health and well-being. I'm wanting you to sort of try that on. Notice when you're just doing something that is centering for you. Notice how you feel there. That's actually your true self. And then there's the self that gets caught up in these thoughts that go away. I'm looking for you to be able to notice and come home, right? Just like those rumble strips on the highway, when you hit them, you notice and you come home, hopefully, back to the lane that you're supposed to be driving. Yeah.
So I just, as you were saying, I kind of had I guess, an aha moment.
A little bit louder, please.
I just had kind of a moment of revelation. This weekend, I was self-talking to myself, we're getting ready to have a yard sale next weekend, and I thought to myself, I should warn my husband I'm going to be grumpy Saturday morning, because I always get grumpy before I do things like this, like have people over, have events, or like we've done other yard sales or open houses or whatever. And I just, so I made a mental note to remind him, and then I just thought to myself, I don't need to have that emotion. Why am I having that? Recognize it. I have some kind of rule that I've set for myself that things have to be perfect before an event happens. And so keeping that in mind this weekend when I have the yard sale, I will much better be able to come back home, remember who I am, what the reason is.
And this idea that garage sales happen, drama optional, right?
Yeah.
Like you can have a garage sale or you can have a garage sale, right? Like there's two different ways to do that, have a continuum, right? And you will probably have moments like that, which actually are related to imposter, because I see imposter syndrome as kind of shame triggered, right? Where you have a not good enough feeling about the condition of your home or the whatever. Imposter syndrome is really that thought habit about your intelligence and your competency. That's just it's a different version of not good enough, right? Which is why I really see imposter syndrome as a shame triggering process. But so you're right, if you witness that, you will have a much better chance of not barking at people. I love that you were gonna warn him, that's cool. That's marriage saving, right? Like, but even better when you actually start to notice yourself get concerned, in that moment, a mindfulness practice is helpful. In that moment, you might want to bring your attention to, like, if you're outside getting that ready and it's a nice day, just the way the day feels. I don't know if anybody noticed how the day feels on you today. It's just, I like let myself stop on the way over here and just let myself really connect with the weather today, right? And so that is bringing your attention to the here and now is what helps you come home. That's how mindfulness fits into this larger puzzle. Anybody on there? All right. And I'm just reminding you about the garden hose analogy. Again, the default setting is actually that you're relaxed and open and in good flow. Right? Don't believe a word I say. Look for moments when you're not caught up in your thinking and you just have flow. That's actually your default setting. And so I'm wanting you to notice the same thing. These are all different ways to notice when you're kinked up. If you remember that it's not the car that creates the kink in the hose when I'm washing my car. It's not my kid. It's not the public speaking. It's not the garage sale. It's not being late for something. Can I say, Lydia had a lot going on this morning. Told me yesterday she might be late coming here. Throughout the day, whether she was late or not, her experience was going to change about that, depending on what thought she had about that. If she was like, well, I'm doing the best I can and I'll get there as soon as I can, she would have less of this than if she was like, I can't let Lisa down and, whatever you might have made up. Right? I could pull the tape out of her head, like whatever's on that is going to be being brought to life in your body. Again, we're running just to help you increase your ability to notice. If anybody out there has a question, Lydia would be happy to tell me what it is, so feel free to ask if you want. The part that I wasn't sure translated very well for you all out in the Zoom room is the picture that I drew about how humans create their moment-to-moment reality. So I remembered, ironically, that I had already done this once, so I found these slides. I'm going to try to do it this way so you might get more of it. Had you remembered that I had these slides?
I found the folder this week.
Oh, you found it? Somebody has been in a class where I've used them. There's just not slides. Okay, so here, I even have a little clicker here. Most people think those external circumstances, that's what's just represented by the E's up there. Let's say that's the garage sale, or that's the parenting, or that's the test, or that's the 3 trainings that you have to do in 1 hour. They're out there. They're pressure points. They're things that have to be done, perhaps. They may be your dissertation proposal or presenting a poster at a conference. Most people feel like those things create their reality, that it comes that way, from the outside in. And the principles really help you see that it comes from the inside out. So if you recognize yourself, that garden hose, that 2 black lines, that's sort of representing your humanness, if you will, connected to creative flow. Again, whatever you want to call it, you're connected to it. From birth to death, it's behind your heartbeat, it's behind your respiration, it's also powering your psychological experience, something we don't talk about. If people could measure that right now and they could say, Lisa has the spark of life. At some point, many years from now, they might measure this body and it won't be here. But between now and then, I have full use of it. Particularly if I'm aware of it and I know how to access it. Not thinking it's the circumstances allows me to access it more fully. So, one of the things we get in that flow is all kinds of new ideas. Part of, I think, breaking free from imposter syndrome is noticing that you have these old recurring thoughts of not good enough, and sometimes when those are activated, it blocks the flow, and we can't let a new thought, a new realization, if you will, of our own competence or our own ability, sometimes can't get through because it's being blocked by an old, unhelpful thought about how we're not smart enough. So we're all connected to this flow. We have a parade of thoughts every day that come to us. And we also, so the first principle, I'm going to think about the 3 principles, is the folks I learned from call that energy mind. So the 3 principles they talk about are mind, thought, and consciousness. And that every human being has connection to mind, thought, and consciousness. And that every human being right now is creating their own experience of reality by using those 3 gifts. This light bulb is representing your consciousness, your ability to illuminate any thought that you hold in front of it, just like the light in a slide projector illuminates the slide and projects the image on the screen. What's on the screen is your version of reality, your separate reality. Your imposter syndrome reality in a moment comes from the thought you're holding that's being illuminated by your consciousness. And again, it's not flat like a movie. It's like, so we're so cool because we bring it to life 3D, Technicolor, like physiologically, right? And so those 3 things working together create our experience. So this is how it looks. You have a thought, let's say in this case it's a new thought, comes to you, and that's the thought you have. Oh, I think if we're going to have an imposter syndrome event, and people might figure out that they have this thing called imposter syndrome, we might want a follow-up class. That's a thought I had one day. That thought led to a feeling of like meaning and purpose, and like we should do this, and it was very yeah kind of feeling. I don't know if I said like yeah kind of feeling. And then I had a bunch of thoughts about that thought, and out of that thought came some behavior, and that's why we're here. Like out of nothing came an idea, and then we brought that into formed reality. Right? When we're having more thoughts about that thoughts, the feeling tends to get bigger. In this case, it was a feeling of like kind of inspiration, I would say, and purpose, which led into that behavior. If that thought was, what the hell was I thinking, giving myself some other new thing to create, then that thought would be a totally different flavor of feeling. Right? One-to-one correlation, whatever thought I'm holding about it is going to get brought into reality. And that physiological experience gets stronger, and the problem is most people don't know the bottom half of this picture exists, so we actually think that the need to do a class is actually causing that angst, if I'm feeling angst about it. Still going to swing into behavior and outcome there, but and one of the things that's troubling is if we think that it's the circumstance that's causing it, we're going to look outside of ourselves for the cure. And that's a donut. And did I talk about cake-like products? And, yeah. That's always been one for me, that if my anger was caused by, let's say, my alcoholic dad, and I couldn't control my dad, then I could always get a donut and it would make it feel better, thus, like, cooling that down and making me not feel that so much. So I thought donuts were magical at the time. And to the point where, you know, addiction can happen because if you can't control the circumstances like grad school or a parent passing away, if that's happening and you can't stop it from happening, and you think you need something outside of yourself to control it, this is how we get into really self-harming or unhelpful patterns, right? So that is happening up there, but what you might notice is that for me, it wasn't actually the donut that changed it, it's that I had a different thought. So, I messed up over here, I probably won't be in the screen, but, so if a different thought gets in front of the consciousness, so instead of that thought about, I can't do this, a different thought about a donut came in there. If we could do that, we can maybe, skip that one, because that's a slide about addiction and binging and craving. But what it does bring is this already thought bucket, right? And so not all the thoughts I have are new and fresh. Some of them are thoughts I've had a million times before. Where do those come from? All kinds of places. So if you wanted to know why you have imposter syndrome thoughts, that you picked up stuff from all these sources and got kind of coagulated into a belief system that you're not as capable as people think you are. And in a moment, that thought gets brought into. So you have memory-based thought, which is where most of your negative thoughts are. So for the person who's recognizing that it's not helpful to your body to hang out with negative thoughts, you have just been a buckethead, right? Like you've been, like more times than necessary when something happens, your first thought comes from your bucket. This is particularly true if you're tired, if you're out of sorts physically, or if you're in a low mood. When I'm in a low mood and something happens, I tend to have less fresh thought and more already thought. And the research would indicate that when I draw from my memory-based thoughts, when I'm in a low mood, I draw the negative ones. Because there's also a lot of cool already thoughts in my thought bucket, but when I'm in a low mood, I don't tend to lasso those in and pull them in. The ones that tend to come are the ones that are more hopeless, more narrow, more problem focused. Our thinking kind of gets narrow like that. So a lot of times you're having the imposter syndrome thought, not really related to anything that's going on, but because you're in a low mood. Which, by the way, if you're witnessing, those imposter thoughts can start being an indicator light that something's going on with you because you don't have those thoughts when you're resting in your default, right? So does that make sense? It seems like that might be making sense. And so catching on to that negative soundtrack, if you will, can start to be as helpful as those rumble strips on the highway. Because you start to know my truest, deepest, wisest self really doesn't believe that. So if that's the song playing on my mental radio, something's up with me. What's up with me? Oh, I haven't eaten. Or, wow, I need to take a nap. Or maybe I should go out for a walk, kind of clear my mind. So this is how it goes again. This is called the thought cycle. 100% of the time, whether you're sleeping or awake, this process is happening for you. You're having a thought, it's being brought into an emotional state and creating a physiological response, and then swinging out into, and out of that, you tend to take a behavior, either one that expresses it or one that tries to shut it down. Depends on what your strategy with that emotion might be. And we know behavior leads to an outcome. And then this is what I said last week that I didn't think anybody in Zoom could see, is this is how it becomes a, quote, syndrome, end quote, right? Like it's something is happening, there's challenges out there, and the thoughts we're having are already thoughts about our lack of ability, and then we just cycle in them, and we just get stuck. And if we see that we're stuck in them, I know I said this last week because I tried to transcribe it on, that's like hard to transcribe. If we see that we're stuck in that pattern, we might be like, oh my God, I have this, like we recognize we have it and we try to stop it by trying to control it. And you can't, it'll just spin it faster. The only way you can have freedom from that is to literally draw your psychological attention away from it. So what I didn't say last week is that while that first image I learned about this was the metaphor of a movie projector, in that the light is stationary and unmovable, and the power source is kind of neutral too. So in that theory, you might think that the only thing you can do is try to wrestle with your film strip. But if you think of that light not as a light bulb, but as a flashlight, it's the light of your psychological attention. And guess what? Your witness self is the one that's holding the light. When you shine it on a fear-based thought, your thinking self comes to life and becomes fear-based. But if you saw that and understood how you operated, you wouldn't have to argue with the fear-based self and make the fear-based self put its fear thought down. It's not going to do that. But you could bring your attention to your dearest friend eating a tortilla chip and then laugh because you just embarrassed her in public, right? And so, or you could shine your attention on your breath. Right? If you have a little one that's scared because they think they see a monster, helping them bring their attention to music or to how their dog feels. Bringing our attention is what interrupts the moment, the psychological moment. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to disinvest from believing the bucket thoughts. You have been pledging allegiance to your bucket thoughts about your own competence for far too long. And then, because part of you already knows it's not true, you've been wrestling that thought. You've been trying to make that thought not come. And I'm telling you, it doesn't matter if it comes. Let it come. Just don't pay it, as my grandpa would say, don't pay it, no, never mind, right? Like, let it come. Sometimes it might even be like, acknowledge it. Like, oh, there's my imposter, making sure I'm on the ball, right? Now, what was I doing? And bringing your attention to something very concrete in the moment. Typically, your already thoughts are about the future, a future failure, and right now, you're actually just sitting here making your PowerPoint for class. Nothing bad has happened. You haven't had a horrible garage sale moment yet. You're just in preparation, and there's nothing broken, and you're totally fine, right? You'll start to notice that some of your already thoughts that are related to imposter syndrome are really intolerance of uncertainty. Right? These are the 3 threats I talked about in the first session. The idea that it's not okay to make a mistake, and being over-responsible. Often I feel least confident about something that I think matters the most. Does that make sense? I see some nods. So, noticing those habits and disengaging from those. When I talk about disengaging from a thought, one of my images about it is if on football Saturday you drive around town or around the holidays, you might see this with like a Santa Claus balloon or a Sparty balloon, If you go by on Saturday, Sparty's out in front of someone's house looking all puffed up and big. You come back on Sunday and Sparty's like laying on the grass, like deflated, right? What happened? What happened? Same balloon, same size. The balloon hasn't changed at all. What happened?
Fan went off.
The fan went off because somebody interrupted the power that was blowing that up. Doesn't matter if your imposter thought is laying on the ground deflated, it's not blocking your view and your gifts can still come out. When you're powering it, it's up in front of your face and you can't see and you don't feel confident. Does that make sense? So we don't have to get rid of the thoughts, we just want to remove our power. Become dedicated to noticing, acknowledging, and bringing our attention somewhere else. And it helps, as you start to do that, you start to trust that if you pull your power away from it, your best effort's going to happen. And so for me, I started to believe that. So there was still some times when physiologically I was going to have to ride out the anxiety because I had the thought. But I started to believe that if I just let it be and just invested, so what I noticed back when I had a lot of imposter syndrome thoughts related to public speaking is I would get so concerned about not doing a good enough job that people didn't get what they need, that I would be up in my head with that and not really even connected to what I wanted to talk about or to the people. And my evaluations for public speaking used to say things like, boy, it started off kind of rocky, but then she kind of got the hang of it, or something like that, right? And I know that I was up in my head and not even in my body at the start of it, because I was so caught up in that, my thinking self versus presenting from my why self, right? What I noticed when I was witnessing, this is my early witnessing, I started to witness that as soon as somebody asked me a question and it became about the person, I would click back in. Right? So then I just started to have the thought, when I was nervous beforehand, yep, I have this now. I know at some point it'll go away. I'm going to invite it to go away as soon as it's able. In the meantime, I'm going to focus on the people in the room. So now, when you guys came in, instead of me being up in my head with my thinking self freaking out, I was like, oh, nice to see you again. Right? I'm aware of people. I was aware of my body and my feet on the floor. I am very aware of what a pretty day it is. I greeted my friend with enthusiasm. I joyfully set up the tables, and I actually felt what the tables felt like when I was moving. Does that make sense? Coming into the present moment, right? I still might have thoughts about who am I, who are you to be talking about imposter syndrome with people who are smarter than you, right? Might still have it, might have just brought it back right now. So I want to just share with you that if you're interested in learning more about the 3 principles, which for me is like really a deeper foundational understanding of what we're talking about, how human beings operate, there is a cool website that somebody's been traveling around videotaping people teaching it all over the world, and they're there for free. The very first introductory one strikes me as like a little overproduced. So it sort of comes across to me like a little new agey, like woo, like. But I would ignore that or just get what you can from that. But there's movies that talk about the different facilitators teaching us all over the place. If you want to listen to the guy I learned most from, his name is Dicken Bettenberg, and he's on there. And what they do is they ask the facilitators a lot of the same questions. Oh, can you describe the 3 principles from your own perspective? So you get to hear lots of people talking about this. There's also a lot of video about people who were like living one way, and then when they learned the principles, what happened. So it's kind of a deeper treatment of that idea, and I might recommend that over the summer. What that helped me with is like really getting more familiar with home base. Like really understanding my innate health and well-being that used to be called health realization, helping people realize their health. And so that's a good thing to be listening to as you travel about your life. The happiness-trap.com is really the initial source that I learned acceptance commitment theory from, which is the psychological flexibility model. One of the things I would say about imposter syndrome is that it's fear-based and it creates rigidity. And so learning the skills related to becoming more flexible will help you interrupt imposter syndrome language. But again, remember, I don't have time to do one thing at a time, right? It's also going to interrupt other unhelpful things like impatience, frustration, road rage. Like the only way to be safe on the road, if you're a person that currently has road rage, is to wake up and notice that driving happens, flipping people off optional, right? That's from my own experience. I used to block those lanes. Did I say this last week? I would when the traffic's merging, people keep driving up and getting in front of people who are clearly already in line. I have a thought about that. And so I used to put my car out there to block the way, even when I had kids in the car. Like I had to figure out, I don't have to be the one to do that, right? Just a thought about that. And then the other source over the summer is the videos that I've done that are based on the happiness trap and other sources that can help you develop some of those skills. It'll increase your ability to witness if that's what you're just learning from right now. So recognizing time, so I will have to say that next time we gather, I just felt like it's so important to see how you operate that it felt important to kind of go back to that. We're gonna talk about, well, I can say these couple things. If you're witnessing, I think there's some things from a curiosity to sort of sort out. Like this, you can use discernment, but you can't discern when you're caught up in it, because that's contaminated processing. You're gonna come up with an answer, but it's not gonna be like your wisdom. When you're home, you can ask the question of, is this healthy self-doubt versus imposter talk? I was having a conversation with my partner over the weekend, where sometimes as a white person who wants to be an anti-racist white person, I can feel like I don't know enough to talk about those issues. And I think sometimes that's true. Like, I need to do more learning, and I'm not as learned in that area as would be helpful. There are other moments when I absolutely know enough to say it, but I think I don't know enough to say it, and it's actually imposter. That's showing up in an area that matters to me about speaking truth to power related to inequity. So sometimes it really is healthy self-doubt that, that it helps you see that you need to do some learning to get best prepared. It's not always imposter talk. Sometimes you're just not ready, right? So when's when? When is which? I don't know how to say that. Self-doubt plus worst case scenario thinking is going to create an imposter freakout, right? So there's healthy and unhealthy doubt in that regard. Another one is healthy boundaries. Like, you might be shame triggered and flying under the radar, or you might be setting a healthy boundary and honoring your larger issues. A friend of mine got opportunity for a really big contract that would take her into working with a state agency around some social justice issues, and she was hesitant. And I kind of thought she maybe was hesitating based on, like, wow, that's a big arena. And what she was really hesitating about is that there's things going on for her in her personal life, some transitions and some challenges, that she doesn't want to be that occupied. So what looked like flying under the radar really wasn't. It was actually healthy boundary setting and saying no when you're not able to take on a big project. Again, that kind of discernment is what we're looking for. And then another thing we want to discern is, this idea of maladaptive perfectionism versus adaptive perfectionism. I'm not sure. I'm trying to try on the idea that it's actually adaptive. I think of it as healthy striving. I would probably not call it adaptive perfectionism, but this is language that's out there. Maladaptive is people who set impossible goals for themselves and are extremely self-critical. The more healthy striving version is people for whom high standards can be positive and motivating instead of crushing. You want to start to discern which is which. If it's healthy striving, you want your best self to help you with that. So then that kind of links into mindful self-compassion. How do you help yourself do healthy striving rather than shaming yourself into crushing perfectionism? Again, perfectionism is the enemy of done, right? If you're going to make it perfect, it's probably not going to get to your advisor, right? Perfectionism is also the enemy of feedback. And feedback can really enrich your work, but if you think it's supposed to be perfect when you let it go, you're going to be really not okay when someone tries to offer you a gift, right? So there's just some other pieces of discernment. Next time, I'm going to ask this question. I'd like you to catch on to yourself a little bit. How do you know when you're in a moment of imposter syndrome? I want you to start to recognize and think of it more like you're imposter triggered, or you're having an imposter moment come up right now. I want you to notice it in your body, in your thinking, your behavior, and if there's an identity trigger, I'd like you to start to be able to see what's going on with that. So starting there next time, asking you to share with me a little bit how it shows up in your body. Like physiologically, how does it show up? And then we're also next time going to talk about how it shows up in your behavior. So sometimes I catch when I'm shame triggered because my body actually feels like I had a hot flash that's emotional. Sometimes I notice I'm shame triggered because I just went off on somebody with intensity. Like I swatted the fly with a bazooka, right? Like it was just too intense. My intensity is an indicator, right? Or I just felt myself withdraw and get really little. So sometimes I feel it in my body and sometimes I can see it in my behavior. So how does the imposter syndrome stuff show up for you And how can you be more aware when it's happening and when it's not? Because we need to discern when it's happening from when it's not. And I will leave it there. If anybody has a question they want me to ask or speak to, you can feel free to email me, and I will get to that question next time. Okay? Thanks for being here. Anything over there, Lydia? Well, you're welcome.
Pause.
Yay.
Pause.
Have a good week.